So, hello, and thank you all for giving us time to talk about our project today. We are very excited to share our results with you. Um, as Kurt gave an introduction about us, I'm just going to go ahead and sort of skip who we are. So if you don't mind going to the next slide. All right. So this project came about based off of our interest in really understanding, whether or not Panama and Costa Rica, being developed and stable economies, although much smaller than Mexico or the United States or Canada for that matter, um, would would or could or is serving as a pull for Northern Triangle labor migration. Um, we have our major project goals there. So as you can see, we wanted to determine whether or not Panama and Costa Rica was a current destination for Northern Triangle migrants, and then what other migrants were present already. We wanted to better understand absorptive capacity writ large, and then last we wanted to understand what sorts of investments are needed to increase capacity for these two countries. Before I hand it off to Katie to talk about our findings in detail, I did just want to take a quick moment to thank the team, um, our colleagues at BTI, Project Champions, the Office of University Programs, for working with us throughout the pandemic. We had a really cool traditional project planned out where we were going to be doing in-person interviewing throughout Panama and Costa Rica, and then the pandemic hit, and we kind of had to just spin around and sort of think of our new plan. And this allowed us to do some really innovative remote interviewing, do a pilot business survey. And I'm really excited for us to share the findings with you. It really was an incredible project in spite of the pandemic. All right, with that, Katie.
All right, thank you. We can go to the next slide, and I'm going to be looking at my slide notes, so I apologize if the slides get ahead. I'll try to remember to tell you when to switch. But yeah, so as Dr. Boyd mentioned, none of those objectives on the previous slide specifically focused on COVID-19, but it's really easy to see how all of them may have been influenced or complicated or impacted by this ongoing global pandemic. So because of that, because of the travel restrictions and the original research methodology that Dr. Boyd just mentioned, all of that associated with COVID-19, we expanded our methodology and adapted it to both sort of substantively cover questions of COVID-19 impact and also to accommodate those kinds of travel restrictions. So what we ended up with was still a multi-method approach. The first phase was still a detailed and comprehensive analysis of basically open source quantitative data. A lot of that was to get at that first question of what are the patterns, what kinds of migrant populations, where are they from, are actually utilizing Costa Rica and Panama as destination countries. And then we did do semi-structured key informant interviews, and we were able to do those remotely in Panama and Costa Rica. So that was one of the adaptations we made. And then we did do this sort of innovative new initial survey of businesses in Costa Rica and Panama. And I can sort of walk you through each of those prongs a little more in detail here. So for the quantitative analysis, this was all of open source data. We didn't do any data collection ourselves, but we put together a lot of what's available and what's out there. So one of the best sources that we came across for this was something called the Americas Barometer. This is an international survey project. And they had in the past, I believe it was the 2018-2019 wave, asked a lot of really relevant questions to these issues of push factors from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador in particular. So we leveraged those rather heavily. We also looked at the sort of overall macro picture of regional migration with World Bank data, UNDESA data, so that's where a lot of the migrant stock figures that we'll be using are coming from. Of course, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, because as we know that asylum seekers and refugees and those in refugee-like situations and all these populations are all moving, not quite exactly together, but they're all part of the story here. And we also used the Government Bureau of Statistics in Costa Rica and Panama. These are both sort of very robust and strong, same in Mexico, as well as data that are available from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So that resulted in a pretty comprehensive picture of where folks are and what's driving a lot of this migration. And then the second prong was qualitative interviews. And these were really helpful to get information you can't access otherwise, and really help us focus on better understanding what Panama and Costa Rica really are like as potential host countries. What are those draws? One of the things that we found from the quantitative analysis is that Northern Triangle migrants represent a very small portion of even the migrant community in Southern Central America. So sort of quantitative methods weren't really going to be able to get us a lot of leverage on that. So we did utilize the key informant interviews, which, as I said, were conducted remotely. We targeted sort of three main populations. We wanted to talk to business leaders to the extent that we could, as well as government officials and sort of experts. Again, many people in those statistics bureaus, as well as the kind of migration bureaucracy there. And because we weren't able to actually do the field work and go directly to these countries, we focused pretty heavily in the key informant interviews on nonprofits, civil society, non-governmental organization, and IGOs, anyone who's working really closely with migrant populations. So we used those interviews to get a sense of what the experiences are like there, what the challenges are, what might be needed to better support or sustain communities that are choosing to live in Costa Rica or Panama. Um, and it also gave us a better sort of nuanced sense of some of the social and ethnic absorptive capacity, or sorry, social absorptive capacities, and what the kind of ethnic breakdowns were in those communities. And finally, we did hear a lot, of course, about COVID-19. So these interviews were taking place last fall for the most part, and they were really starting to feel impacts. So we got a lot of great information that we just wouldn't have accessed otherwise, and that was a really helpful portion of it. But also with that method, we knew that a lot of the things that we would have wanted to be able to look at from the quantitative study about business, economics, industries were all going to be changing, and that that was all going to be lagged. So what we did was we came up with a survey of businesses in both of these target countries. A lot of this was to sort of hone in on answers to that project objective 3. So what is the existing capacity, which is a little bit of objective 2, and then where are some sort of potential intervention points for investment or policy interventions in general. This was conducted based on a list from national business registries. So we purchased a commercial list that consolidated a lot of information from Panama and Costa Rica's official business registries. And this list-based approach is what's known as a convenience sample, and it's great for exploratory research and allowed us to maximize our total number of responses. We had 261 businesses in Panama and 168 businesses in Costa Rica actually respond to and take our survey. It's not a representative sample, but I think it provided a lot better insight than we would have been able to get through either a handful of interviews or in any kind of sort of timely manner with secondary or lagged data collection. And in case you're curious, this was a completely online survey and was through the University of Maryland's Qualtrics platform. All right. Oh, that was good. Okay, next slide. I'll do it this time. Thank you. So as Dr. Boyd mentioned, on paper, Costa Rica and Panama definitely have real strengths and some weaknesses as potential host countries for those who might be leaving the Northern Triangle countries. But comparatively, it has a higher GNI and GDP per capita. There's sizable migrant and immigrant communities in both destination countries. It's seen GDP growth. Obviously, COVID-19 complicates the picture of these sort of even these high level statistics. So recent unemployment figures are pretty high all around, particularly high in Costa Rica, you might note. And there was, for most of these, at least in the last quarter that we looked at for this, negative GDP growth. So but still, overall, the thing that we found sort of most interesting from these high-level figures with this, just that there are very few migrants from the Northern Triangle that have already been opting for a southern route. So I believe it's the third line in the chart, the blue countries there, Costa Rica and Panama, really small numbers, just under 21,000 in Costa Rica, under 7,000 in Panama of the number of migrants from any three of those Northern Triangle countries. And that figure in the United States is over 3 million. So that was one of the biggest sort of things we found from those macro level indicators. Like I said, one of the main goals of the quantitative research was to assess migration flows, and one of the more interesting and consistent findings we had was on this issue of push factors and what's driving individuals to leave Northern Triangle countries. So this is some of the survey results from the Latin Barometer. Sorry, it used to be it's the Latin LAPOP project, the Americas Barometer. And these are population-based surveys. This isn't something we collected. They're incredibly rigorous, really just the gold standard. And they're from 2018 to 2019, and they ask about all sorts of things. We focused most on Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, the Northern Triangle countries, for this analysis because the set of questions were asked were the same and they were all very, very relevant, we found. It's also worth noting that these do not reflect anything about COVID-19. So the surveys were finished much like at the very, very early in 2019. But we basically found that physical insecurity measures were just very high for these countries overall. So if you look at that first question, 28% of households in Guatemala said that yes, and fear, out of response to fear of being victim of a crime, in the last 12 months, they had not let their children go to school at least one day. They just kept them out because they were afraid of the physical well-being of the child. In Honduras, that number was as high as 31% of respondents. 1 in 5 respondents had, for that second question, indicated that yes, this was true of them, that they had themselves personally been the victim of some kind of crime, threat, etc. So these numbers are incredibly high all across the board, and that's definitely part of the story in terms of why people are leaving. However, it's still, and next slide, sorry, thank you. It is, though, we found that not simply a story of kind of refugees or humanitarian factors, because many households we found were facing both economic and physical insecurity, what we are going to refer to here as complex insecurity. So in addition to struggling financially, they're facing crime, violence, fear of safety for their families. The bar here, I hope, is reasonably easy to read, but that sort of farthest right category, that darkest one, is the percentage of respondents who were facing neither income insecurity nor physical insecurity, and that's relatively low. As you can see, 21% in Guatemala, 19 in El Salvador, 14 in Honduras, and the second bar over, that like darkish blue, that's not too pale, the 36% at the top for all populations, that's the percentage of the population that was facing both income insecurity and physical insecurity. I could talk a little bit about these definitions, but honestly, no matter sort of how we coded it or the way, however we cut it, these were about right. 1 in 3 respondents in Guatemala and El Salvador were facing this complex insecurity, and 4 in 10 in Honduras. We also leveraged a really great question in these surveys, which directly asked about the intent of individuals to migrate. So thank you. Yes, sorry. We looked at a question that asked, do you intend to live or work in another country in the next 3 years? And this was asked in 2018 of all 3 countries. The raw sort of overall number was in Guatemala, 25% of respondents said yes, they did intend to live or work in a different country sometime in the next 3 years. In El Salvador, that was 26, and in Honduras, that was 38%. And we used this variable as a sort of dependent variable for a logistical regression model. And basically, we found that the complex insecurity indicator that we had come up with, so are you both physically insecure and economically insecure in your home country, was the single best indicator and positive correlate of whether someone said, yes, they intended to migrate. Having both insecurity types, so that's what those models G2, S2, and H2 are indicating, so that middle line, was all positively and statistically significantly correlated with that intent to migrate. The other thing that was really interesting to us was that having actually only a single insecurity, so if you were either economically or physically insecure, but not both, and also not neither, you were no more or less likely in Guatemala or Honduras to have an intent to migrate. And actually in Honduras, it was negatively correlated. So if you were only income insecure or only physically insecure in Honduras, you were less likely to say that you would migrate. And finally, having neither insecurity type was negatively correlated. So if you're not facing these insecurities, you're not likely to say that you plan to leave the country. All right, next slide. So that was one of the major findings in terms of push factors, is that we kind of know that these migration flows are being driven disproportionately by complex security challenges in these home countries. But in terms of pull factors, where these Northern Triangle immigrant populations are ending up, we know that this is a result of several things. And the quantitative analysis pointed to a strong pull factor, kinship, being existing in the United States, and also found that other destination countries were notably less of a draw on this dimension. So between 80 and 90% of all Northern Triangle migrants living abroad today are in the United States. That varies a little bit by country. And only about 4% of the entire and only about 3 to 6%, I apologize, 3 to 6% are anywhere in Central America. And there's only about, on the flip side, Northern Triangle migrants represent only about 4% of the entire migrant population in Panama. Just that's under that 7,000, as we saw in that larger table slide. And similarly, only about 4% in Costa Rica, that 20,000 individuals. So that pull factor is not drawing people south, which was something that we also thought is really important for contextualizing some of the other findings as we go forward. The qualitative interviews, we then sort of focused on diving deeper into, okay, what populations are in these countries in Panama and Costa Rica, and how do Northern Trianglers kind of fit in. So one of the things we found is that actually, yeah, there is a really good reputation for Panama and Costa Rica both as host countries. So the overall safety and stability are really genuine pull factors. Thank you. And both countries generally have a very good reputation for official policies towards migrants. Northern Triangle migrants or Northern Triangle citizens are allowed to enter these countries without sort of visa or any kind of special authorization. And Costa Rica in particular is considered sort of a regional and in many cases a world leader on immigrant and migration issues. That being said, some of the other things we found from the qualitative interviews were that it's a pretty expensive and lengthy bureaucratic hurdle to actually get work authorization, residency permits, or to go through an asylum process in both of these countries. During that time, you're unable to, as someone waiting for a determination or in the process of getting a residency permit, unable to secure formal employment or provide for their families. It's also more difficult to get housing if you don't have a residency permit and or formal work authorization. We also found, again, that while the statistics show that kinship networks for Northern Triangle migrants might be limited, our interviews with these key informants suggest, yes, that's true. These aren't really large, sizable populations. You can't really point to a part of any of the capital cities or a particular industry where you find a lot of immigrants from the Northern Triangle working and thriving. That being said, we did hear a lot about NGO, IGO, and civil society organizations that may be providing these kinds of essential support services and may even be emulating kinship networks. So we'll circle back to this when we get to the policy recommendations. But ultimately, there does seem to be a real opportunity here for, rather than, you can't actually create a new kind of kinship network, but you can emulate some of the services that those provide. And I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A as well. But we thought this was one of the more interesting findings in terms of possible levers that outside actors can pull. So supporting NGOs, developing those capacities, providing financial support and other kinds of talent may actually allow outside actors to bolster these networks that do exist, even though they're not kinship networks, that provide these sort of support and essential services. We also started hearing a lot in our interviews about COVID-19 and some of the impacts that they've been having. Unfortunately, one of the things that came up time and time again was this sort of more anti-outsider, somewhat xenophobic rhetoric and attitudes towards migrant communities, and this had sort of been growing. It exists in a low level, sort of most places in most countries, and Costa Rica and Panama had been a little bit better, again, as they sort of are often very proud of being multicultural, of being transit points for a lot of different immigrants and migrants. But these kind of narratives were on the rise, and it was making it a little more difficult for communities or immigrants and migrants newly arrived especially, to secure housing or employment. Obviously, the economic impact of COVID-19 has been severe. Unemployment soared both in Panama and in Costa Rica. In Panama, it was, we actually heard sort of from the qualitative interviews, which wasn't reflected in the top line numbers, that employment was particularly difficult because whereas in Costa Rica, there were some different types of support. So support programs available, a little bit more like some of the PPP type programs that we had in the United States. In Panama, that was much less the case, or at least according to the people we spoke to, that was much less the case. So it seemed pretty pronounced there. There were also, of course, lockdowns, border closures. This limited the flow, the ordinary flow of people across borders. And unfortunately, in addition to immigrants and migrants being sort of afraid that they might be trapped on one side of the border or other, separated from families, there was also some bad press that came out about border camps that may have tarnished, though likely temporarily, the image of Panama and Costa Rica. So you may even have heard or read these stories as well, but Costa Rica in particular had issues with certain kinds of migrant transit camps and refugees camps just not getting clean water or food and having a lot of really serious illness, some of it COVID, but some of it not, going through there. And finally, there was some concern that relief programs and aid were difficult for populations to access. So a lot of different marginalized groups weren't able to, but this included migrants and refugees. And now we are sort of hearing, not necessarily as part of the research, but as we're sort of keeping our attention on these things, that there's some concern as to whether vaccination programs will ultimately reach migrants or refugees. So these were all sort of the COVID-19 concerns that we heard coming out of our qualitative interviews. All right, next slide. So now we turn to trying to make sense of the economic and employment opportunities, that sort of economic absorptive capacity of Panama and or Costa Rica to migrant populations. So as part of the business survey, we asked businesses whether they employed workers from outside the country, as well as where those workers were from and what kinds of firms employed them. So the chart on the right was asked among those who said that, yes, we do currently employ someone from outside the country. And the most common sort of country of origin in Costa Rica was Nicaragua, which makes sense. It borders, they border one another, and there is a lot of labor migration in Nicaragua, and there's a lot of harvesting, particularly in the coffee and other agricultural industries, that employ seasonal or temporary workers, and there's a lot of worker exchange programs there. It was less common in to have workers from El Salvador, Guatemala, or Mexico. Those numbers are sort of in the middle there. In Panama, Venezuela was the country of origin for most workers. Not shown here, but the sort of overall top line number we did find was about 15% of businesses in Costa Rica and 10% of businesses in Panama indicated that they had probably or definitely employed Northern Triangle migrants in their firm at some point. So again, this goes back to this is a relatively smaller population in these countries, but we did find it interesting that 15% is actually rather higher than the sort of 4 to 5%. So it does look like they are finding work when they are there, which we thought was interesting. Overall, we found that about 53% of the businesses in Panama and 55% in Costa Rica that responded to the survey actually do currently employ workers from outside the country. We found that larger firms were more likely to be employing them, not terribly surprising. And to the extent that we were able to make sense of industry, the ends were somewhat small, so a lot of these are not statistically significant. But in Panama, the trend was towards construction, hotels, and restaurants, saying that employment of migrants was very common in their industry. We didn't get a clear sense in Costa Rica, but again, that was just because of the distribution, we think, of the industries that did respond. And we also found that not a lot of businesses were hiring a lot of seasonal workers. So while seasonal workers are not necessarily from out of the country, for instance, retail firms take on seasonal workers during the holidays. These positions may be easier for workers from outside the country to take, as they're less likely to be sort of formal positions. We also asked about formal and informal employment, but some of those results were a little harder to interpret because, yeah, if you want to ask about that, we can talk about it. But we thought that the seasonal figures were pretty much the most interesting. The survey also asked directly about how COVID-19 had impacted businesses and industries. And as you can see, a lot of the respondents, the majority, said that both their industry and their own business had been hurt a lot. In Costa Rica, the discrepancy between their own business versus their industry was a little bit higher. So if you're looking at the top line, that hurt a lot, 52% versus 71%. But overall, this was a pretty serious negative impact. We did note that this sort of difference between business level assessment and industry level assessment makes a lot of sense, because at this point in the pandemic, when we were surveying people, it was November, December, and January. So November 2020 to January 21. If your business was still open by then, you probably were doing a little bit better than your industry, to be honest. And so we thought that this was sort of a useful indicator of that we were getting to the right sorts of businesses with our survey. But in any event, the high level numbers there, looks like it was pretty impactful. Next slide. Thank you. We also asked finally, so directly, what impact did COVID-19 have on the likelihood that your firm would employ workers from outside your country of origin? And we found that, over about half of the businesses in Panama said that they were now less likely to hire immigrants or migrants from outside Panama, and 45% in Costa Rica said the same. They were less likely to hire from outside Costa Rica. There were about 36 and 38% in Panama and Costa Rica, respectively, that said that had no impact on them, which was good, and the very small percentage that said more likely. It's worth noting that this is not something that you can really disentangle from a general reluctance to hire during this. We tried to get at, specifically in the question wording, whether this is an anti-foreign worker kind of sentiment, but it's not conclusive one way or the other here. But in any event, whether it's all jobs in general or jobs for specific populations or specific communities, this less likely figure was something that was consistent with what we'd seen in the past couple of slides, but very, very definitively suggests that the absorptive capacity is at least temporarily fairly limited. Another interesting finding from the business survey derived from a comment we heard from some of the qualitative interviews, which says that there are these real bureaucratic hurdles and disincentives facing businesses in terms of the existing regulations. So one of these was in the form of fines. A few interviewees mentioned that there were high fines for hiring people without documentation, or with, specifically the term is proper work authorization, but it was unclear from the interviews whether these fines made an impact, or even how well known or well enforced they were. So we would sometimes ask individuals, well, what about fines? What do you think those impacts have? And some people who you would think might be knowledgeable about these weren't really particularly aware of them. So we therefore asked businesses directly about these in the survey, and we found that in Costa Rica, there was very little awareness, basically. So respondents could either say that they knew of a business that was fined, that they'd heard of businesses getting fined sort of in general, or that they hadn't heard of anyone ever being fined. And in Costa Rica, that 83% said that they just never heard of a business ever actually getting a fine. In Panama, if that never heard of was 43%. So over half of businesses in Panama had sort of knew a business that had been fined, or had at least sort of heard in general of businesses that got fined. So in Costa Rica, it definitely seems unlikely that these fines are really standing in the way of hiring from immigrant or migrant communities. In Panama, however, this might be sort of a place to look into a little more carefully for a policy intervention of some kind. A few later questions we asked were whether you might be more likely to hire migrants or immigrants if you didn't have to worry about fines or business suspensions. And nearly 1 in 3 companies in Panama that that already employed migrants said that they'd be a lot more likely to extend hiring in these communities if they didn't have to worry about these fines. So it may be playing as part of the story. It seems to be part of the story in Panama and less so in Costa Rica. All right, next slide. And finally, we asked about the flip side to fines, which is to say, potential positive inducements or other levers that you could manipulate via policy, and how these things might impact a business's willingness to hire immigrants or migrants from outside the country. So we asked about skill set match, about direct financial incentives, about programs to help integrate foreign workers, and about the number of applicants for positions from migrant or immigrant communities. And we asked, please tell us whether this would make you or your company more willing to hire immigrant or migrant workers from outside, in this case, Costa Rica. We found in the data that Northern Triangle migrants in general were more likely to work in businesses that employed migrants already. So that's why we have broken up the answers or the responses to these questions into those three bars. So that top bar of all respondents is across the board, sorry, it's very difficult on my screen to take a look. Yeah, across the board, 38% of businesses asked in Costa Rica said that they'd be no more likely to hire from these communities if immigrant skill sets better matched their company's needs, whereas that number was 33% among those who already employed migrants or immigrants. And again, we can come back to this slide if anyone wants to in the Q&A, but I'll give sort of some high-level assessment. But the reason we wanted to look at these two separately was that we thought that there may be some way in which targeting businesses, especially in a climate where there may be a sort of hesitancy to hire from migrant or immigrant populations, targeting businesses that already had these employees on their payroll might be a more effective or a better way to get some of these interventions to have a broader impact on hiring of migrants and immigrants in general, and also might have a better chance of directly impacting Northern Triangle migrant opportunities. Yeah, so generally what we found is that it is the case that bolstering companies that are already hiring in migrant and immigrant communities would be generally better, and also that most of the policy interventions that we were offering up or considering would have at least a slightly larger chance of working among those companies or sectors or industries where that kind of employment pattern was already quite common. The findings in Costa Rica are a little bit more marginal, but in Panama, we did find that it really does seem to make more sense to target businesses or industries that are already employing migrants. And this would sort of encourage them to continue or increase hiring from those communities. So one of the things that we thought was particularly interesting here was this, the difference between, for instance, the financial incentives, so that second chunk of bars, is whereas about 45% of businesses that are not employing immigrants or migrants today said, financial incentives really are going to make me no more likely. Over half of businesses that are doing so said they'd be at least somewhat, if not a lot more likely to expanding hire in those communities if they were already employing immigrants or migrants. Additionally, we thought that in particular in Panama, this question of skill set match or better integration programs, these were reasonably popular, and actually the question of whether the immigrant skill set was a good match for the company, that seemed to be a more important factor in Panama than even just direct financial incentives. So this suggests some potential policy opportunities where you can work, again, potentially with those NGOs or IGOs that are already present in communities and help with something like better employer matching, rather than just simply saying, oh, here are some financial incentives to companies, which may be a little more difficult to implement for a number of reasons. All right, so triangulating from some of these highlights and the findings across all three of these methodological approaches helped us sort of better understand this question of absorptive capacity and identified opportunities for us to increase that capacity in Southern Central American states. And this enabled us to come up with a series of policy recommendations that would help to improve Oh, thank you. Sorry, I don't know why I'm so terrible at that. Policy recommendations that would help us to improve the ability of Southern Central American states to absorb migrants in general and Northern Triangle migrants in particular. So one of the things, and I believe that some of the even earlier sessions in this sort of annual meeting noted this possibility of streamlining and reducing the cost of bureaucratic processes for immigrant residency and work authorization. Panama and Costa Rica both sort of have these issues. One thing we heard from interviewees was that basically something like simultaneous applications for residency and work authorization might be useful, as well as potentially providing temporary or provisional work authorization for asylum seekers who are waiting decisions in like highly backlogged system. Also, as I highlighted before, there is the possibility of supporting industries and companies that have hired migrants and immigrants in the past, because it seems like they're more receptive to possible levers to do so in the future. But also that programs that improve employer and employee skill set matching and integration programs in businesses may be what companies need more than just sort of straight cash incentives. We also came to the recommendation of sort of trying to feed positive and at least fact-based campaigns that counter some of these anti-immigrant narratives, especially with respect to COVID-19. The concern here is basically that Panama and Costa Rica really did have quite good reputations, certainly along a number of dimensions as host countries, and we wouldn't want that reputation to sort of be tarnished. So some kind of active measures there to make sure that this is sort of a short-term phenomenon rather than something that really upsets the social absorptive capacity after the pandemic is over. That's where that recommendation is coming from. We also thought that COVID-19 policies regarding relief programs and vaccinations should at least carefully consider how they're going to include those with irregular status. And also to support the work of community organizations and NGOs that may serve as essential networks for migrants and immigrant communities. Again, there's no way we can sort of immediately boost the sheer number of Northern Triangle immigrants and migrants in Panama and Costa Rica. Those low numbers are just a fact of the community, but there's also the possibility of supporting those types of organizations that are in turn providing services that emulate kinship networks in these countries. And finally, we might want to message and promote Panama and Costa Rica's good reputations, stability, and overall strengths as destination countries. One thing that came out of the America's Barometer survey was that there's a portion of potential migrants, so those who said that yes, they intended to live or work outside their country of origin, that do not have any close ties to the United States. So these are kind of a potentially gettable sounds. Sorry, I have a little bit of a pollster background, so there's a little bit of electoral politics in there. But these are populations that may be really amenable to and able to receive messages about alternative host and destination countries, and being able to highlight or generally promote these features of a southern route might actually have a real impact with some of those. All right, next slide. So the research team is now very much in transition mode and transitioning some of these findings however we can. So these deliverables are in addition to the quantitative report, the qualitative report, and the final report, the last of which triangulates across those multi-method data collection analyses and sort of synthesizes the findings like we tried to do here today. But in addition to that, we have a panel presentation coming up next week at the American Association for Public Opinion Research. This is an element of the business survey that was actually a contact experiment, and I'd also just really like to thank our project champions and everyone for supporting our including that element in our research design. If you're curious, I can talk a little bit more about that, but it's a real honor to be invited to give a kind of a methodology talk at this conference, and that's one of the transition things we're sort of most excited about. We're also co-authoring an article that analyzes migration in Central America using that Laptop America's Barometer data. So we have some co-authors who are also interested in this issue of complex security. And I actually have an email from a co-author that arrived this morning that I owe a response to. So that's moving and we're getting very close to submitting that. And then we have, courtesy of Dr. Boyd, 2 one-page infographics that have been published by START on why leave home, and then the impact of COVID-19 on Central American businesses. If we go to the next slide, there are the sort of very small mock-ups there. And I think that we've already gotten a lot of positive feedback on these, and I just shout out to Dr. Boyd for taking a lot of what I tried to present here today and putting them into a really digestible and sort of easy to see, read, understand, and contemplate format. All right. I did want to try to reserve some time for questions and answers, so hopefully we've managed to do that. And yeah, those are our contact email addresses if you want to ask anything follow up. Otherwise, we're here. Thank you so much.